Hi. I just kind of had some thoughts that I figured would be best delivered um, on camera while I'm still thinking about them. And I kind of wanted to talk about two things that um, are sort of distantly related to each other, but are demonstrative of maybe a more broadly applicable, like, cool kind of way of breaking down um, positions, issues, claims, and how you can respond to them. And the two things that come to mind that are sort of distantly related is this idea of the master slave morality dynamic, as a lot of philosophers have explored it, but it's a dynamic that I think Nietzsche maybe gives the best sort of exposition of. So that's the first one, and then the second one is the term identity politics. Oh, my computer's gonna die. Hold on. Okay. Um, and those two are going to sort of fold into this larger idea that I'm not quite sure how to formulate yet, but hopefully, as I sort of reason through it on camera, maybe I can come up with something good. So the master slave dynamic, the central idea is that in interpersonal and social dynamics, there's basically always going to be a disparity in the way that people understand their role, and that there's going to be somebody who has more power and somebody who has less power in a dynamic. And essentially, people can come to understand their location socially through these sort of means, but the dynamic is such that it is sort of a fixed relation between these two groups, the master group and the slave group. And what those terms essentially mean is that the master defines themselves as containing the positive qualities, as sort of setting the discourse. They set the what it means to engage in a moral manner. They determine, these are people, like in the old days, they would have been the priests, they would have been the kings and queens, as economic means of production develop and societies get more sort of politically complicated. These tend to become more like the wealthy folks, the famous people, sort of become masters, in the sense that they are asserting a positive, in the sense, in this non-normative sense, but like the extensible idea of, like, you can have a positive assertion, which is an assertion of the existence or presence of something, and you can have a negative assertion, which is the lack or absence, a claim to the lack or absence of something, and they're positively asserting morals that affirm sort of who they are as people. And then there's the slaves, who are sort of defined in contrast to that role in society. That they look at the masters and they say, okay, the masters are bad because they inflict some, they have power over me in a way that I feel is unjust. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, everything that they are not, that's what's good. That's how I will define my morals, is by being not like the masters of society. And this is sort of, a ham-fisted way of describing this dynamic, but it works for my purposes, and so that's how I'm going to do it. And so you end up with this weird thing where the masters have set this agenda, or the parameters of what is to be considered moral. And the slaves come along and they think to themselves, well, since the masters are wrong, their moral assertions are wrong, which means that the right moral assertions, and this is the crucial step that I want to talk about, the right moral assertions are the inverted or the opposite ones from the ones that the masters make. Now, this is kind of tricky territory, but the claim that Nietzsche arrives at in his work that I think is illuminating is that the correct thing to do, if you recognize that a moral scheme is bad, the way to negate that moral scheme is not by affirming its inverse, it's by doing away with it entirely, right? So what would that look like? Let's say a master in a racist society says, okay, well, the good thing to be is Anglo-Saxon, white, WASP type person. Now there are a couple of ways you can react to that. In this version of society, the disempowered class or the slave class would be non-white Anglo-Saxon WASPy people. And if they were to take the position of the slave in the moral dynamic that Nietzsche describes, what they would say is, aha, it's in fact bad to be white and it is good to be the other races, or, non-WASPy people. Which, when you put it in those terms, it seems sort of obvious that that's not, you haven't done a good thing. You haven't gotten rid of the real crux of the issue, which was that the racial bifurcation was itself unjustified. So the real way to reject the morals of the dominant, master class is to reject them outright and say, the the racial composition of a person does not have any bearing on whether they're good or bad people. So that's, I sort of unintentionally in that point kind of bled over into the identity politics issue. But there's this way that the term identity politics gets used now that is, I think, largely pretty divorced from the way it sort of naturally arose in the literature. And so I went to the Wikipedia page about identity politics, and I just want to read what they have as like the passage and context where identity politics as a notion sort of originates. So the term identity politics may have been used in political discourse since at least the 1970s. The first known written appearance of the term is found in April 1977 statement of the black feminist socialist group Combahee River Collective, which was originally printed in 1979's Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism. As you can already gather, it's a pretty radical group of folks that sort of coined this term. Later in Homegirls, a black feminist anthology edited by Barbara Smith. She and the Combahee River Collective, of which she was a founding member, have been credited with coining the term, meaning identity politics. In their terminal statement, they said, this is a quote from the Combahee River Collective statement. As children, we realized that we were different from boys and that we were treated different. For example, when we were told in the same breath to be quiet, both for the sake of being, quote, ladylike, and to make us less objectionable in the eyes of white people. In the process of consciousness raising, actually life sharing, we began to recognize the commonality of our experiences and, from the sharing and growing consciousness, to build a politics that will change our lives and inevitably end our oppression. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. So you can see in that statement, the term originates in a sense to mean, a politics that arises from identity. It's like a meeting of one's identity with the forces that oppose it, that blossoms into a politics of liberation. Okay, so in that sense, it's a term that signifies a need to change the dynamics, a need to reject the socio-political dynamics that lead to the oppression of these particular identities, right? So it's a similar problem to the master-slave dynamic, as I put it earlier, as many philosophers have talked about it. And then, of course, as these things always sort of seem to do, this term that arose, in literature, in expert literature, in academic discussions about this phenomenon, it was sort of co-opted by a mainstream that didn't bother to learn what it meant, or was sort of foisted upon them by a political landscape that likes to take advantage of things that sound radical while sort of undercutting what's actually radical about them, in a way very similar to what the slave does in the master-slave dynamic, which is the slave says, this system is unjust, these morals are unjust, therefore I will affirm the negation of them, as opposed to negating the scheme altogether. And that is where we get this sort of current dynamic, which, the memes about, more female drone pilots or whatever, that, everybody likes to dunk on liberals with. It's actually a really interesting thing, because what modern liberals, and I mean like centrist Democrats, have done is they've taken the term identity politics, and what they've gained from that is, okay, the thing to do, what these people are saying is these sort of white male oppressors, what the originators of the term, these white male oppressors are doing is bad. And it arises out of our identity, which is at odds with whiteness and maleness, black femaleness. And so what liberals have done is they say, okay, well, the solution to that is to get more black chicks in those positions. This is no different than the negating of white supremacy with some other sort of racial supremacy, or at least domination of whiteness. There's no real progress that's been made. You're still affirming the same bifurcation along racial lines. You've just taken the opposite position. Hey folks, it's me from the editing room. I noticed while I was rewatching this video that this could easily be mistaken for me saying that having black women in positions of power is reverse racism or something along those lines, and that's not at all what I'm saying. And I think the context of the video makes it obvious, but I think that particular statement certainly doesn't do me any favors in getting my idea across, which is essentially you haven't actually negated the dynamic that leads to this oppression of black women by having black women be in the positions that legitimize that oppression. You have only just played Mad Libs. with who does the legitimizing of it. It doesn't do anything to reduce the magnitude of oppression on its own. It has to be coupled with a more radical solution that I will suggest. So I hope that that's clear. I don't want any of you conservative sort of dirtbags, you conservative sort of goons and ghouls, suggesting that what I've just said is that having black women in positions of power is bad because it's racist against white people or it's oppression against white folks. That's not what I'm saying. And with that all being said, I hope I've made myself clear, and let's get back to it. And, conservatives rightly condemn this, although, of course, what conservatives want is just to go back to white supremacy. I say go back to reaffirm white supremacy. So that's not really any better. And they use the term identity politics in this sort of, in this way that's not in keeping with what the term actually originally came to mean or was coined to mean. And the broader point that I wanted to have here, which the master-slave dynamic is a good general way of understanding it. This identity politics, I think, is a good example of it. Is that there are sort of three positions that come up when somebody makes a claim or espouses a view. You can agree with their conclusions. You can agree with their premises, but disagree with their conclusions, which would amount to a sort of rejection of one or more premises, but overall maintaining the same sort of argumentative structure, which would, in the examples I've given, it would be, you maintain the racial dynamic that is implied by the man who says it is good to be white and bad to be anything else. You maintain the racial dynamic, you just play Mad Libs and you change, you exchange the races, basically. Say it's good to be anything else and bad to be white. So you reject the premises in a way, but you maintain the same form. Or there's rejecting the format altogether. Those are the three positions you can take. Again, you can agree with the logical form and you can agree with the conclusion. You can disagree with the conclusion, but still sort of agree with the logical form, just, swap some words out for the particulars, but maintain the same structure. Or three, you can reject the structure altogether. And generally speaking, the only way you're going to resolve the issues that arise in a particular system of propositions, say a racial supremacist system of propositions, the only way you're going to resolve the issues permanently is by rejecting the system altogether. So this is just, I don't know, different kind of video from the other ones, but nobody watches them anyway, so I'm really just trying some stuff out. I hope that you could follow this one. This is type of content I'd like to do more of, so leave a like if you liked it, or a dislike if you disliked it, and if you want to reject the like-dislike dichotomy altogether, leave a comment.